Great. Well, good afternoon to you from the East Coast of the United States, and good morning, good evening if you're in a different time zone throughout the world. We really are appreciative that you joined us. My name is Eric Alexander. I'm Executive Director of the Brigham Education Institute. And together with my partner, Subha Ramani, and many other team members, we're thrilled to bring to you some of the programming here today. I really am personally excited about this series, and I want to thank all three of the upcoming presenters, starting with Dr. Ramani here today. I really think this topic resonates with many of us, that it's somehow just not as easy, or we're not as good at doing the qualitative piece to med-ed research as we are the quantitative piece. So I think the interest here is very high, and I think we're all going to learn a lot. So appreciative to our author, our leadership group. Please note that there's three sessions here that lie ahead. We're going to make this a series over our summertime, starting today into July and early August. So I invite you to all of these if you want to note these dates. And Subha, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Eric. And I see some friends from around the world, and I also see Amy Sullivan, a local expert in qualitative research and research in general. She's a leader of medical education research at Harvard Medical School and Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. I'm delighted that she's decided to lead the last part of the series, which is on analysis and rigor. And thank you, Amy. And so let me get started. So we are not going to solve everything about qualitative research in one day, and that's why we decided to do it as a series. And it's also geared towards people who wish to undertake qualitative projects, but always have a sense of, oh, I don't know what's going on. So it's really for people starting. It's not for experts necessarily. But with that, let me get started. What are we going to do today is essentially how do we make informed decisions about choosing qualitative methodology? Describe three possibly major approaches or paradigms for qualitative research. And I'll go through the steps involved in qualitative study design. Some of them are very familiar to everybody. It's common across qualitative or quantitative. And then we'll try to draft some research questions that are appropriate for this methodology. So you can raise your hand if you've engaged in qualitative research. Okay, virtual hands are good too. Okay, very good. I see quite a few. Thumbs up, hands. Okay. And okay, you can stop raising your hand. Now, next raise of hand is going to be all those who have engaged in qualitative research and don't have any challenges. It's absolutely flows smoothly. Please raise your hand. Okay, I'm not raising my hand at all, because every time I learn something and I learn that I made an error, and experts correct me. So what I want you to do is reflect on your own goals, one goal, one challenge, or one burning question, which we will come back to in the end. Okay, just reflect on it and write it down. Don't type it in the chat yet, because by then there'll be 100 more chats and we'd have forgotten what we had asked. So qualitative studies are conducted in natural settings. This is Norway. Looking outside one of our hotel windows. So it's a natural setting. It's not manipulated. It is inductive, meaning a lot of the information or the analysis or the writing, the conclusions come from the data rather than deductive, when you go in with necessarily a hypothesis and then you prove it or you test a correlation. It's words, not numbers. And to me, numbers are bad enough, but words are even more complex. But it is flexible. meaning nothing is linear in qualitative research. You go back, and you go back. For example, as simple as literature review. We're not finished doing the literature review before we start our experiments, because you go back, because something comes from the data, and then all of a sudden you're saying, oh, that never occurred to me. Let me go back and do another literature review. So things might change along the way. It is subjective. And let me tell you, subjective is not a bad word. I think we are all subjective people. We experience, we feel, we have emotions. Subjective is very good, but a slightly neutral look at the subjective data is a good thing for the researchers. Participants' perspectives. That is the underpinning of qualitative methodology. And we never call them subjects because we're not doing something to them. They are doing something for us. So, and there are many criteria for rigor or trustworthiness. So Denson and Lincoln is a huge, big fat textbook, which I don't think I've finished all of anyway in the last 10 years. And I don't think I will in my lifetime. However, I'll give you a definition. Qualitative research is multi-method in focus. It involves an interpretive, naturalistic approach to subject matter. This means that qualitative researchers study things in their natural setting, attempt to make sense of, interpret phenomenon, but in terms of the meaning people or participants bring to them. It can describe routine and problematic moments and meanings in individuals' lives. So what are some of the data or outcomes we study? Opinions, attitudes, perceptions, process, behavior, how things happen, and factors that play a role in these processes. So these are the outcomes that we are looking for. So just a quick comparison, and neither of them is superior to the other. In fact, the more you do them together, the more data, the more conclusions we can all draw as educators. So quantitative research is objective, so deals with numbers. It's finite, it has limits around it. It's interventionist, so there is a lot of intervention, educational intervention, and then a measurement of some outcomes, for example. It's based on observation and measurement. You can have, most of the time, we have some priori hypothesis, which we are testing, and it's deductive, that's what it means, and it's value neutral. And this is what people refer to as objective. Qualitative, on the other hand, is subjective. People bring their own experiences and feelings. It's interactive. The participants, if it's a single participant, they are engaging with the interviewer. You're having a conversation. If it's multiple participants, such as in a focus group, they are interacting with each other. And in fact, they may change their narrative might change all along the way. And we can create knowledge as part of the research process, construct theory, come up with a hypothesis, design a framework. It's exploratory, inductive. It comes from the data, and it's value laden. People bring values with their feelings, and which is perfectly fine. So just something I want to say is, we frequently in health professions education, we narrow in our thinking. We think of clinical research, database research, bench research, and think those are the principles that need to apply to education as well. But thinking beyond that, we should look towards anthropology, social sciences, and this is where we need to be also, and that this is where qualitative methodology comes from, really. So to summarize the first part, why and what are the benefits? Why choose a qualitative approach? You don't start off by saying, I'm going to do a qualitative study. No, it's about the fit. First of all, the researcher, the investigator, your worldview. So I love narrative. I love anthropology, or looking at the world, the educational world, like an anthropologist. So I have to believe in it, first of all. And so researchers' worldview. So I also believe that there is no one single right answer to everything. Okay, so as a positivist, there are more paradigms. We won't go into that, but we can get into it in the discussion in the end. It's called positivist, post-positivist, now constructivist. Constructivist means you let the data come to you. Okay. If there's no previous knowledge of a phenomenon, so you're just starting out exploring, and to add depth to a quantitative study. So that's mixed method research. So I'll pause and just take a quick look at, I will share my 12 tips in terms of, you'll get much more from that. I'll send my 12 tips article in the end. So we do qualitative, okay. The right way to collect data, all right, excellent. So keep all this in your minds, and then we'll come back to the burning questions. I think you're all asking the right questions. So I tried actually talking about a set of steps for us to think about. Just remember, sometimes it could be, it may be a loop and not really linear steps. You may go back, but you start with an area of research interest. It's not specific to qualitative for anything. What is the area you're interested in? But then don't make it so loosey-goosey. You need to come to a focused study question. Or in fact, even better, a problem that we wish to study. Okay. And then we do a literature review. So far, so good. It's the same. But then this thing called framework or approach or paradigm, and we'll talk about that in a second. And the way you approach your qualitative study. Everything depends on the study question. Yeah. And then the design, then you go on to, so far, it's what's called methodology or the approach to your entire study. Now we're getting into the steps to accomplish the methodology or the study question, which is the methods. So participants, who's your sample? How do you recruit them? How many do you recruit, but not sample size calculation? What are the sources of data, or who are the sources of data? And how do you collect them? And you ask the question, somebody asked a question about data collection. There is no one way, and it's coming up in part 2, but I'll briefly touch on it. Then you analyze the data. Now, at any point so far, that is still in the methods, and then presenting your data or write-up. But what I didn't talk about here is rigor. There are criteria for trustworthiness or rigor, which you will hear about in part 3. So let's start here. Research interest. In this situation, we delve into theory a lot more, such as organizational behavior, educational or learning theories, developmental theories, social theories. So this is where we might depart a little bit from the quantitative field. This research question, and I'll show you some samples. So in qualitative research study questions, we don't generally say assessment or measurement or correlation so much, but the verbs used typically are explore, discover, understand. So it's basically telling the reviewer, the editor, that you have been open to participants' opinions and perspectives and perceptions. So that is a slight difference as well. Then you do a literature review. Focus on the study question. I mean, you can't do everything in the entire field. Focus on the study question for now. Focus also, the literature review also needs to focus on the theory that you might be allowing to guide you. Okay, it might change. You might change your mind and go back and read a different theory, and that's perfectly fine. And but identify what is a problem, what is the educational problem we wish to study, what have other people said, but what are the gaps, or what is not yet been explained well. And that provides direction for data collection. Now we'll talk about, this is something that confuses a lot of people. And I will reassure everyone by saying, if I will touch on what these mean, but it doesn't have to be. If you just don't make your study fit into one of these, it's fine. Just say undifferentiated qualitative study, and that's fine. Let's start with phenomenology. All right, phenomenology is exploration of participants' experiences of a certain, a phenomenon, which is what we refer to as lived experience, and what is the meaning they ascribe to it. So a little more than how do you feel, like what is the meaning, and I'll come to that in a second. Then I've gone topsy-turvy in the order. And grounded theory. Grounded theory is when we are trying to explain a social phenomenon and constructing a theory from our data or grounded in participants' data. That is what grounded theory is. There usually is an X and a Y because a social phenomenon requires two things, two factors at the very minimum. So it could be, what is your institutional culture, your learning culture, and how do educators develop their educator identity? What is the interaction? So that is an X and a Y, and you're trying, so what is your departmental culture or feedback culture, and how does it impact the feedback conversations? So there's, and what is your, what about hierarchy in the surgical world, and how does it impact teamwork in the OR? So these are all the social phenomena you're trying to explain, but you're not trying to test what you think or believe, but you're trying to explore from the participants. So in the operating room, you might explore perspectives of the nurses, the anesthesiologists, the surgeons, the techs, and then, and say, how is each group viewing this? And then talk about, what about the hierarchical environment in the OR, and how does it impact what each team member, each interprofessional team member perceives the teamwork, okay? But that's an example. Ethnography is a study of culture straight out of anthropology, but we have modified it because we can't do what, say, David Attenborough sits and does, or follow the elephant based on the freshness of the dung for about months on end. We can't do that. So we have certainly deviated from the original ethnographic method, but it's still the study of culture. And in our situation, a culture is a learning culture, professional culture, and how people behave, what is the language people use, what are the artifacts people use, and what are the interactions between people. And a lot of it requires observation. But instead of what we call prolonged observation, it may be a series of shorter observations. And then it's not that you just observe, you also make some notes, but you want to confirm your interpretations by, say, interviewing the participants whom you've observed. And you can be, and generally you step back and don't impose your opinions on the observed participants. Case study. So a slight deviation, a case study is when you're actually, the focus of your study is the phenomenon, and then all the people and all the factors that impact that phenomenon. For example, trauma in the emergency room, a violent patient in the emergency room. Okay, so the phenomenon now is are not the participants, but actually, so violent incidents in the emergency room. And then you pull all the stakeholders in and study to a certain extent, you observe the phenomenon, and then you study how different stakeholders perceive or experience that phenomenon. That's a case study. And finally, discourse analysis is when you do a deeper dive into language people use. And so we'll go into, let's see, we'll go into the exercise very briefly after I talk about the research question. There is, just like the PICO, you have a spider for qualitative questions. So who are the people, although sample participants, really? It should be a P-pider, not spider, but that's okay. The sample is the participants. The phenomenon of interest, it might be the OR culture or trauma in the emergency room. The design, so you say qualitative design, but if you can go further, you can say this is an ethnographic study, ethnography, and then how are the outcomes evaluated and the type of research. Well, it's a spider, but I'll give you some examples here. So let's start with the top. How do people learn? Not good enough. Very open, but it's not very focused, right? Then you can go further to do postgraduate trainees like lectures and interview studies. Not aligned because it says qualitative, but then do postgraduate trainees like lectures. You could very simply be answered by yes, no, maybe. Okay, so we not want a little more in-depth exploration. So how can we increase, to study how we can increase the number of applications for a fixed number of medical school places? It's not important enough, maybe, to the world of medical education or health professions education. It's very focused, very local interest. So what interactional structures are used in feedback sequences during general practice bedside teaching encounters? Again, the importance, it's better. Now it's getting deeper, but it's still not specific enough. Now, the most exploratory, but also tells us most informative is something like this. How does cognitive empathy, specific to the doctor-patient relationship, change over the course of medical school? Let's trim the middle bit. And that is a very good qualitative question. I'm just giving you examples. Okay, here's a scenario. You are a health professions educator designing a course on communication skills for your students. Your course will consist of, doesn't matter really, 10 weekly sessions. Last year, you noticed that nearly every, let's say you've been teaching for 10 years, and over the last year or so, you've noticed that everybody has all kinds of electronic devices in class, and they're looking at it quite a lot. So you being a qualitative educator that you are, you're not making assumptions that they are doing, corresponding with their friends and family or checking their stock market. But they are, you know that they're learning. And you're not that, let's say, you're like me, you're not that up to date with all the electronic platforms that are available, but you want to know what is going on and how do I harness their online platforms to benefit communication across students and learning in your own sessions. Essentially, your students, in brief, your students have a variety of electronic devices. You're looking at it quite often in the classroom, and you want to capture their knowledge of technology and their communication method in order to benefit learning in your own classroom. So what are you supposed to do? Formulate one qualitative study question. Okay, so you'll have about 6 or 7 people per group, and I'll type this into the chat. So formulate one study question and list maybe one, and this is not important. One qualitative approach that might be appropriate. And then we'll come back, type into the chat. One group reporter types into the chat per group. So the most important part of the exercise is formulate a qualitative study question. And if you have the approach, great. If not, forget it. So what I'm going to do is, I'll try to go through as many of the groups as possible. So group one.
I'll share our group a little bit, Subha.
Okay.
We had a lot of ideas, some of which now I'm blanking on because I wrote them in the chat, but now the chat disappeared. But one of the neat ideas was you could use a qualitative approach to understand how digital communication or use of a digital device is used differently or provides different information in diverse environments, that perhaps the same mechanism, the same device, the same platform is diverse in what it tells you in anesthesia versus medicine, or how the learner might be using it, which would come out, we hope, through, again, this kind of qualitative approach of a broad discussion with a focus group or individuals, or a broader description that could be written.
Thanks, Eric. So how are electronic platforms or electronic devices used in different educational environments? So that, in essence, and how we collect the data, who the participants are going to be, and that is an absolutely appropriate qualitative study.
And I might even add another word in which maybe really lends itself to qualitative research, which is, we were kind of talking about what is the value of a digital device. And when you think about defining value, it's going to be different in different areas, essentially.
Thanks, Eric. Anyone from group two?
Actually, we have made two questions. The first question is, what is the student perspective regarding the communication skill course? This one is the first question. The second one is that, how do the students perceive the use of electronic device, blended learning for the learning and assessment in the communication skill course?
Okay. So you're studying student perspective of the value or benefit of using online devices for learning and assessment in this specific communication skills course. Thank you, Amna. Thank you very much. Room 4 is Amy's room.
We also took a similar approach as Abna, and imagine ourselves being the teacher in that course, and want to study what is happening with our students and their use of electronic devices, and how to use that information to apply it actually to our course, since it's a communication course. So we came up with many different questions. I'll just read the final one. That is, again, very similar to Abna's. And we were interested in the question is, how do students in a communication course describe their experience of using electronic devices for their learning and communication? And the idea was to try to understand the advantages, disadvantages, and again, apply it to our course.
Thank you. So far, most people have studied the student perspective. And then I have from group 1, Mohammed, how do undergraduate students use online teaching platforms in their daily communication? So beyond this particular course, okay? And group 5, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, I'm also from group 1.
Okay.
So Mohammad's given our question, but we were, brainstorming a lot on this, and then Dr. Mansoor raised a very good point that we all agreed on, that we have to explore from many angles, not just the students. So then we decided that, we should also maybe do something like, how do experiences of online learning platforms influence teaching and learning of communication skills?
Okay.
Which would not just include the students, but also the teachers as part of the sample.
All right. Thank you, Komal. So we're getting it from different viewpoints now for the teachers and students. What are the benefits? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So I think I took notes for our group, unless somebody else wants to speak up, I'm happy to share the question that we kind of came up with. And the question was explore students' experience with and motivation for using electronics in the classroom. We also thought of kind of sub questions that were similar to what you all talked about, kind of the why and the how, but primarily wanted to go a little bit more broad about experience and motivation.
Thank you. So, and I came up with, and you can even dive deeper and bring theory into the mix if you want to study. For example, and as far as approaches, I'll give you, actually, I'll show the slide so you can actually see what I'm talking about. So this is, I made this slide up just to show that the approach should depend on the questions that we formulate. You don't go in saying, I'm going to use ethnography, I'm going to use phenomenology. That comes right after the study question or aim. So for example, it could be exploring the patterns and reasons for use of the online devices in the classroom, teachers versus students. Now that is almost studying a bit of culture, like what is the teacher's culture versus the student's culture. So that could be ethnography. Now, phenomenology, student or teacher experiences about active use of electronic devices in teaching and learning and the meaning they attribute to it. Because, in fact, one of Amy Sullivan's colleagues and a good friend, I think this happened in her classroom at Harvard Medical School. And some people actually felt the meaning attributed was being connected meant they were connected to their classmates as well. They felt isolated or lost their sense of belonging if they were not connected because they saw their fellow students chatting with each other avidly and they felt left out. Now, the third thing, and if you want to use a grounded theory approach, this is an appropriate study question to explain whether and how the level of skill in combining or balancing internet use with in-class discussions can contribute to identity formation in the classroom. Now you're bringing in identity theory, and then you're what I was talking about, this is a social phenomenon. So the skill level and identity formation. You're trying to explain and gathering data to explain this. And so, yes, hand up, Dominique.
Yeah, sure. What about, we were also discussing in our group about kind of of studying the use of electronic devices as opposed to the experience, but the use of electronic devices.
Yeah.
Would that be a case study kind of because it's a phenomenon, you're studying the phenomenon?
Actually, just how are they using it can come under ethnography. All right. So how are different students using online devices or platforms in the classroom? So you're actually standing back and observing, are they engaging with each other during their use? And are some people feeling left out? Some people feeling more enthusiastic, looking more enthusiastic? So it's you're almost studying the culture of use in the classroom. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So small tweaks to the study question, and you tweak your approach as well. But the study questions have to come first. We are open for burning questions at the moment.
I'll ask a question, Subha. I'm going to guess it may resonate with some other novice qualitative researchers like myself, which is how often in a qualitative study, which can be very bottom up, can you be loose or vague with your hypothesis? Acknowledging we're going to understand the value proposition of X in environment Y, versus still not letting it go too far astray by being so vague that it could mean anything, if that makes sense. How tight do you need to be on the bottom-up approach?
Right. You do not have to have a hypothesis. You can go in with a preliminary hypothesis, but then be willing to be dashed down and say, nope, this did not apply and I've constructed something new. But one thing you generally don't do is test hypothesis, because qualitative methodology is not so appropriate for testing hypothesis necessarily. You can, of course, use qualitative, and I'm going to ask Amy to comment on a second. You can actually use, test a hypothesis and collect more data for an in-depth exploration using qualitative, which means the mix of quantitative and qualitative. The study question, the second part is the study questions are not vague. They can be quite specific. So, and what makes it even more specific is if we keep talking about a theoretical or a conceptual framework going in. So if you have a grounding in certain principles, either theoretical principles or a model or a framework of, and then that makes it even more specific, brings it close together. So vague, no, open or ended, yes. Amy?
And I think I'll just draw the simple for Amy before you jump in, Amy. I think a very oversimplistic step I'll just share is, so often we're in medical education research surveys to our learners or the study group, where we often get quantitative data. How often did you do X? Please describe this, that, and the other. But then we often will put open-ended questions at the end of a survey that say something like, what are the strengths of this teaching intervention? What are the weaknesses, or what would you improve? And it's a little too loose to think that open-ended of a question can simply then be applied to effective qualitative analysis, bottom up. And yet, if you spend a little more time, is what I'm gathering, to anchor it a little bit better, then you can certainly use data that come from those types of surveys if the question's asked a little better. So that was my take on it. But Amy, please jump in as well.
Sure. So as far as the hypothesis testing, I agree that, in general, you're not going to test hypotheses with qualitative research, but you're more likely to generate hypotheses. Some of what we're talking about would lend itself to a mixed method study. And in general, mixed methods would either fall into the concurrent or convergent design, which means you do qualitative and quantitative at the same time. So you could do a survey and focus groups, for example, and then afterwards combine the two types of data to interpret them. So one might give you frequency of something or prevalence in a group, and then the other one might give you more meaning and nuance. Or you can do sequential mixed methods, where you could do qualitative first and generate hypotheses and then do a quantitative. And as far as a qualitative items in a survey, you just have to be a little careful about interpreting from them, because they tend to have not much depth of data. So you can get, and often people don't answer, not everyone answers it, or it's kind of, so anyway, it's a good first step, but I wouldn't go too far in a qualitative analysis there.
So thank you, Amy. And, I think some questions that came up, the spider was just a sort of a loose framework here. You don't have to use spider, but basically what I'm trying to say is, who are you in a study question? You need to know who your participants are, or your target audience, that's the sample, phenomenon of interest, identity formation, teaching, teamwork, feedback, knowledge, and then design is really qualitative. But then if you want to dive deeper into the type of approach, okay, the study of culture, study of meaning, the explanation of social phenomenon, and evaluation is the wrong word here in SPIDER, but it's more of how are you going to collect data to assess your outcomes in a way, to answer your study questions. And so don't go too much on the spider. I just put it up there. But let's see, somebody talked about you need to be a native of the language your participants record their responses in. It's a very good question, Rafia. And you need to be the interviewer or the person gathering the data certainly would need to be a native of the language, they understand. But let's say there have been situations and where they do the, they do the transcription, translation, and then you can involve non-native speakers in the analysis. So certainly data collection and transcription and translation, you need to be a native speaker. But beyond that, you can actually, because I remember being involved in a study from Thailand where it was translated, and although the lead author, she did the initial analysis, I was able to read the translated parts and then talk to her about the themes that we came up with. Distinguishing theory from framework can be, yes, it is another topic, but essentially a framework, conceptual framework, think of it as a big circle, and then theory is a little circle within that big circle. So what is a conceptual framework? It is the approach, why you're doing this study, why is it important, and who cares? How does it matter to other people beyond your own little group? So I was just talking about identity formation. That is a theory, okay? But you can also say you designed a curriculum, for example, using the Kern's 6-step approach to curriculum development. It's still a conceptual framework, but it's not a theory, it's a model. Or leadership development, Potter's 8 stages of leadership development, those are models. So conceptual framework is what you use to explain your approach to your whole study and why it matters beyond your local environment. But it can take another hour to talk about it.
And Subha, with now time running short, I just want to thank you. I want to thank in advance the other speakers, AMEE, including yourself. We very much look forward to inviting everyone back to learn the next step, which is kind of then how do you do it? Once we know what it is now, how do we actually do it and pull it off? So I welcome anyone to stay on for other questions. I just wanted to be respectful of those who had to leave after an hour here. So thanks again for joining today.
So part 2 is going to be done by Janneke Frambach from Maastricht University. She's going to talk about data collection. And part 3 is going to be AMEE Sullivan, is analysis and rigor. Okay, and we look forward to seeing everyone.